All right, well, let's begin with the word of prayer, shall we? Lord, we are so thankful for your goodness to us, and we're thankful for the Old Testament and the theology that it establishes. And indeed, your word is a theological book. It is truth. It is history in its fullness as you work in reality in this world to accomplish your will, to actualize your plan, to do your work, to establish the truth. That is what is happening, and help us to capture all of that as best as we can. Thank you for books like Exodus and Leviticus, which highlight your redemptive power, your supremacy, your holiness, your grace, your forgiveness, and the nature of salvation in all its dynamics and all its beauty, and help us to understand all those component parts so that we not only have a complete theology, but we have complete thankfulness and worship for what you have done and are doing in our lives. And along that line, O Lord, I pray for these fellow believers here. This is just a time of the semester that is exhausting and grueling. It is leading up to that Thanksgiving break, which seems still a little bit far out. And I just pray that you would give these dear brothers and sisters the strength and the drive to pursue you, to honor you in their studies, to uphold your name in the dorms and in their interactions on this campus and outside of this campus. May they be those who lift up Christ high and love you from their heart, and never lose that, and never lose the sanctifying influence of the Holy Spirit who changes lives step by step according to your plan. So be honored at this time and encourage us and strengthen us for those reasons and ultimately unto your glory. And in your name we pray. Amen. Well, we need to cover some things to really frame the context of what we're about to talk about today. There's part of me that wishes we could have just kept going and discussed Exodus 34 and following last class, but that didn't happen, and that's okay. The Lord had a better plan. But nevertheless, we need to have a context. Otherwise, you don't understand how powerful these next moments are and how formative they need to be and must be, not only in our minds, but even also in Scripture itself. This is just so very important. So, along that line, we know from the very beginning, the agenda of God revolves around creation and God's glory, manifested specifically in his plan of Genesis 3:15, the seed crushing Satan. So with that, we have God ultimately, through his preservation of the seed, raising up a nation that will make an international impact. You guys are all familiar with this by now. You should know about the Abrahamic covenant. Are you all with me on this? You should know what it contains. And now in Exodus, all of those realities of Israel's fundamental values found in the Abrahamic covenant and such, God turning evil to good, that is launched. That is launched on the international scene because God destroys and devastates the world's first superpower, that is Egypt. Y'all with me on this? Okay, this is review. And with that launch, we launch the reality of redemption, which ties together everything that we've been talking about. Blessing, a land even, because they're redeemed unto that inheritance. There is the whole notion of the seed, of a raising up of a nation that's going to culminate in one king. It is demonstrating God's supremacy and his agenda. That's really important. It is demonstrating God's supremacy as he destroys the Egyptian pantheon, shows his greatness over even a political nation, as well as his agenda. We're back to evil to good and the whole concept of blessing. Now, as Israel is redeemed, God in the wilderness cultivates a context for the Mosaic covenant. So far, we've talked about the Noahic covenant, yes. We've talked about the Abrahamic covenant, and then we left off last time discussing the nature of the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic covenant. And what we said is, in the wilderness, God already instructs Israel. Do you guys remember what the nature of the law is? It is a what? Teacher. The very word Torah means to instruct or to point. It's like a sign. You must know that. You need to know that. And as we said before, a sign or a teacher or a pointer can't save you. No one has ever been saved by an exit sign. Like maybe the exit sign fell on a bad guy and killed them or something, and you were saved by it. But usually, exit signs don't save you in and of themselves. They point you to that which does provide you salvation. See the difference between the two? So very important. From the very beginning, God had instructed Israel that the law is important because it's a sign. And its importance is in that function, not outside of it, not more than that. But nevertheless, it has that important function. It is an instructor. It is a sign. Just like God pointed out a tree, which alludes back to what? The Garden of Eden. So the law points you to that which gives you life. That is God's intent in Exodus 15. It points out Israel's sin. It points out the nature of God. The law is, like I said, and I'll say it again when we get to Leviticus, it's language. Actions speak louder than what? Words. And by living a certain way that the law demands Israel to do, they receive in and of themselves instruction and give instruction to the whole world. That is the purpose of the law. Now, along that line, that's why in Exodus 19, Israel's purpose is to be a kingdom of, anyone remember the language? Kingdom of priests. What do priests do? They lead people to who? God. They have an international priestly role to leverage the law in its instructive, pointing, signification, function to guide people to God. That's their job. That's their job in a nutshell. Now, having said this, the way that the law works, and by the way, this is the way the Mosaic covenant works. The Mosaic covenant, do you guys remember me talking about it's an administrative or a managing covenant? Do you guys recall this? It manages the promises of the Noahic and Abrahamic covenant in order to what? Teach. In order to teach. It cannot fulfill the Mosaic, or it cannot fulfill the Abrahamic covenant nor the Noahic covenant. It just manages those promises for the sake of instruction, like a instructing manager or a manager that teaches you how to do something so that you actually can get into your task full time. So that's the nature of the Mosaic covenant. It teaches, it instructs, and it does so effectively. Now, having said all of this, there are some important things, if you understand the nature of the law, if you understand the nature of the Mosaic covenant, that are now important. First, and I think I've said this before, but I want to investigate it a little bit more, and you can just write it somewhere in your notes. So, here's the first thing. According to the Bible, i.e. the New Testament, you are no longer under the law. Key terms. You are no longer under the law. Cross-reference Romans 6. Cross-reference Galatians 5. Cross-reference Romans 14:15. Cross-reference Mark, where Jesus declares all foods clean. Cross-reference Acts 10. There are just a lot of passages that teach that you're no longer under the law. Romans 6, Galatians 5, Mark, where Jesus declares all foods clean, where we have the declaration in Acts 10, where God commands Peter to eat. There are just a variety of ways that the New Testament declares we are not under, keyword, the law. We are not under the law. And here's what you need to know. We're not under the law, and that's okay. That's okay. That is not saying that the Bible is no longer authoritative. That is not saying that the Old Testament law failed. That is not saying that the Old Testament law was faulty. Because if you think about it, If the purpose of the law was to get you to a point where you're living Christ directly, if it was trying to point your way to salvation and now you have it, did the law fail? It what? It succeeded. Let me put it differently. Are you all right now living under your parents' roof necessarily? Most of you would say what? No, I live in the dorms. I'm under the roof of Hotchkiss, or whatever. Who's the RD of Hotchkiss? Oh, yeah, Copley. I'm under Copley's roof, or whatever, or past it was Ona's roof. But anyway, so you're under somebody else's roof, fine. Does that mean your parents failed? Would you say, well, since I'm no longer under your roof, you're a failure? No, that's how you lose tuition money. But even more than that, you recognize, and I think your parents would recognize and thank the Lord for, that you're their success. Why? Because you can live outside of their roof. Yes? Because you can live outside of the roof pleasing the Lord. Everything they dreamed of, you are doing. That's a huge praise as a parent when you see your children walking with the Lord. There are lots of things that will make them happy, but that should make them the happiest. And they realize then how successful and how blessed they have been. Just because there's a change of situation doesn't mean someone failed. Sometimes it actually means that you succeeded. And in the same way, when Moses sees that now there are people living for Christ and doing what the law always pointed them, always instructed them to do, he doesn't think that the Mosaic covenant failed. He knows it what? Succeeded. Mission accomplished. Does this make sense to everybody? If you do exactly what the law was intending for you to do, that's not a failure. That's a success. It would be kind of like this. Let's say you went to a store and you held a coupon, and the coupon said buy one, get one free. And you're like, this is a sweet deal. So you get buy one, get one free, and you go to the registrar, and they're like, sorry, sir, we can't honor the coupon. You say, why not? Well, it's expired. Oh, you have a fallible coupon, right? Your store is a failure because you don't honor your coupons. Do you start going, oh, this is just such a great conspiracy, and all this kind of... No, we understand. The store actually is keeping the what? Coupon. It's actually honoring the coupon and honoring the instructions on the coupon that say it expires on such and such a what? Date. If you didn't do that, the store actually would be breaking the principle of the what? The coupon. Y'all with me on this? So when the law says we're pointing you to Christ, and when he comes, there's going to be a change. And when that happens, that's not a failure, that's a what? That's a success. Y'all with me on this? You're not under the law, and that's okay. You are proof that the law worked. You are proof that the Mosaic covenant was successful. Okay? In other words, the Bible is infallible. Its purposes always come to pass. But it's more than that. And here's the second thing. If you understand how the law works, then you can learn from it and apply it. That's really important. Even though you are not under the law teaches truths that always apply for all time. In fact, that is why the New Testament carries over and can use the law the way it does to say, hey, don't murder, or don't do this, or don't do that, or don't you read in the law that this is happening? In other words, the law still has authority even if you're not under it a certain way. The law still has binding influence even if you are not under it a certain way. Y'all with me on this? Again, back to your parents. You're not under their household. That's actually their success. Even more than that, look, they told you when you were a little kid to get sleep. Now you wish you could. This shows your parents are still influential. Y'all with me on this? It shows that they were successful. It shows that their instruction, although you might do it differently, or you might want to do it even better. Like, Mom, you said 8. I think I really need 18. So that's fine. Well, okay, maybe not. But there's a logic of I still know what my parents said is right. Therefore, I will live that out. They have influence over your life. The law, we might not be under it to do the letter of the law, but if you understand how it works and what it always was intending, it still has authoritative influence over our lives in that it still instructs us about truths that don't change. Y'all with me on this? And so, now when you look at laws, for example, we did this with the Ten Commandments. If the Ten Commandments are part of the Mosaic Covenant and you're not under the Mosaic Covenant, then you're not under technically what? The Ten Commandments. Yes? However, we said the Ten Commandments are not just laws in and of themselves. They point back to what? Anyone remember? They point back to creation. Principles of creation. And last time I checked, we're all part of creation. So those rules and those principles still what? They still apply. Yes? And what you do is you learn through the Ten Commandments these principles that now apply even in more ways than what was originally stipulated. Did you catch that? Let me put it this way. Does the Old Testament law or even the New Testament law prohibit pornography explicitly? Not explicitly, but does it prohibit it? Yes. Why? Because it teaches you a truth that demands something of your life in all applications. Does this make sense? In all implications. Look, does the Old Testament say, or the New Testament say, do not cuss or curse or harbor anger when someone cuts you off on the 5 freeway? No. It does not even have a law that says, thou shalt not curse thy neighbor when his ox cart comes in front of thine. Okay? It doesn't do that. But it tells us, and our Lord reminds us of the principle, don't be angry. Yeah? And so that applies to a whole bunch of situations. Are you all with me on this? And so, sometimes I think we think, oh, I'm not under the law. I shouldn't have to read it. I shouldn't have to think about it. No, you still do. Not to live it out in and of itself, because you're not under it, and that's okay. It shows it succeeded. But to what? To learn from it. To exercise your brain to learn these principles and think through how to live that out. Yeah?
So if we're not under the old law anymore, how come Jewish people still don't eat pig?
Yeah, well, they don't believe they're not under the law, pardon the double negative. And even more, some people they do it for a lot of the reasons that Paul talks about. Even believers in Israel will do it for the reasons that Paul talked about in Romans 14:15 to prevent, or 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 to prevent a brother or sister from stumbling. Because before they knew Christ, their consciences were so sensitive to this issue that they think they are sinning, and we don't want them to do anything against their conscience. So like in Israel, if we're not cooking kosher, like at Ibex, we'll try to do it really, really in private, because we don't want to give anyone the implication that we're trying to rebel or promote what in their eyes is sin. That we don't, but we know we have the freedom to do so even still. So we just have to be very sensitive to that. That's a great question. Speak to me.
How would we apply slave laws?
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. So that's great. I even have that on my paper to talk about. So, all right. So when we look at creation, we think, okay, yeah, I might not have to live this law exactly a certain way. Maybe I do. Maybe that's the same thing. Well, great. But we need to know why we are doing what we're doing. Yes? We need to know it's not because the law in and of itself tells me. It's because the law teaches me about this principle that has ramifications on my life. Does this make sense to everybody? And that's how we examine law after law after law after law. Understanding that applications may differ. between people and from time to time and in different contexts. But the truth that drives those applications never change. Everyone with me on this? So let me give you an example. Slave law. Slave law. We talked about this, and this is kind of doing double duty because that was one thing I really wanted you to see. And we said that slave laws, on one hand, when the slave desires to stay with their master, that is recapitulating or reiterating or repeating or reenacting what Israel's relationship with God is to be. Because God delivered Israel from slavery so that they would what? Anyone remember? They would be his slaves. They would serve him. You guys remember that language? And so when the slave says, I love my master, I don't want to leave him, that is recapitulating or reenacting what Israel should say about their God. I love my God. I don't want to what? Leave him. And so there is a right kind of slavery, which, by the way, we all enact, because Paul even calls himself what? Sometimes I think we hear it in English, a servant of God or a servant of Christ. But really that term is what? Slave. We're all slaves. We are all slaves. And we need to understand there is a form of slavery that is good. A form of it that is good, where there is a good master and you have surrendered your life to him. We call that almost lordship salvation, yes? That's essentially what it is. He's Lord. He's the king. I'm the servant. I'm the slave. And I live for him. His will is my will. Period. However, at the same time, we have a kind of slavery that is wrong. One that dehumanizes people. And we are against that. Israel is against that. That's what they experienced in a sense in Egypt. And do you guys remember the law where if you kill so-and-so, you die. If you kill so-and-so, you die. If you kill a slave, you what? You die. Why? Because a slave is a what? He's a person. She's a person. Does this make sense to everybody? If you harm someone, then you must pay reparations. If you harm someone, you must pay reparations. If you harm a slave, you must what? Pay. Why? Because a slave is a what? He's a person. She's a person, equal to all those other situations. This is the nature of the law. Are y'all with me on this? Now, if you trace this out, if we understand that there is a principle on one hand, that God is our master, and that our human relationships with each other are to project that greater reality about God. Y'all with me on this? That he's our good master. And if we also know, hey, but we aren't going to dehumanize people. We're going to make sure we are very stern and very strict and very clear on that all humans are made in the image of Adam. They are made in the image of God. They are one of us, and we uphold this. Y'all with me on this? Then, turn with me to the book of Colossians, which uses this language. Okay? And Colossians, anyone know what other book of Colossians that's super important? Comes with as in they came together. Philemon, right? It's like, here's Colossians, here's Philemon. Go get them, Onesimus. Okay, so Colossians comes with Philemon. They go hand in hand. You should read them together. Why? Because that's the way Paul intended it. Okay, and there are just so many powerful things in these books. On a footnote, this is not a New Testament survey, but I was reading an article by a commentator published on Philemon. He says, I'm so glad we published this Philemon commentary as a separate volume because sometimes Philemon is just a footnote. And I agree. This isn't a New Testament survey, but Philemon sometimes gets the short end of the stick, which is a travesty. Anyway, we're back in Colossians. And I can take pot shots because I'm the OT guy, so I can just criticize them. I'm just kidding. But here we are, Colossians. But I do teach Greek, so it's fair. So, okay, Colossians 3. We there? Verse 22. Slaves, obey what? Your masters, according to the flesh and everything, yes? Not with eye service as those who plan, but in the sincerity of heart, fearing what? The Lord. Here's what you lose in English, but you gain if you know the biblical languages. The word master and Lord are the same. What's the word play? So let me do it this way. Slaves, obey your what? Master. Fearing who? The master. See how that works? Why are we doing it this way? What is the wordplay that Paul is making? He's saying, look, the way you serve your earthly master reflects and is driven by the way you fear your what? Heavenly master. See that? Isn't that the exact same logic we just have been talking about in the slave laws? That it is meant to reenact or recapitulate the way that God, the master, has taken care of Israel, and Israel loves to serve his master. Does this make sense to everybody? That must be an intentional part of how we serve even our own employer. Notice verse 24, because, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of repentance. Everyone see that in verse 24? It's from the Lord. So you know. And that's why Paul at the very end of this verse says, serve who? The Lord Christ, I think, or something. Does it say something like that? But you already know the word Lord is actually the same word what? Master. Serve your true master, Christ. Get that? Your service of an earthly master is actually your service to Jesus. Okay, and there's a lot of things going on in this. If you want to talk about, hey, how do I live out that slave law? Look, you might not own slaves. You might not be a quote-unquote slave in the modern sense to anybody. And in the modern sense, you shouldn't be. In the biblical sense, you should be. But if you stop and think about this, our relationship with our employer then is the same way. And this is important for you all here. If you realize that your vocational work is actually an expression of your work for Christ, you're going to do it differently, right? Because you're not going to just do junk for the Lord Jesus Christ. Does this make sense to everybody? And that needs to be what drives you. And by the way, in an age of entitlement, you will stand out because you will be very different than the rest. Where everyone else is interested in themselves and driven to do the least amount of things, you are driven in the opposite direction. Does this make sense? I'm going to lecture on this maybe, if we have time, in Essentials of Christian Thought later. But you know what Calvinists were actually best known for historically at their time? It wasn't Calvinism. It was actually what? Work ethic. Everyone wanted to hire Calvinists because they work hard. Isn't that interesting? And it's through that they talked about the doctrine, which is where you need to understand this. It's not just that Christ drives you in work. Your work then needs to deliberately point people to who? To Christ. Does this start to make sense to everybody? And this ties with what was said from the very beginning of the book. The book of Colossians as a whole is about the preeminence of Christ. And in chapter 3, which is part of the chapter that we're in right now, it says, therefore, if you are raised with Christ, seek the things what? Above. Where Christ is. How do I do that? I work a certain way unto Christ. And in doing so, before my workplace, I'm going to point people to what? Christ. Does this make sense to everybody? That is the way you live, and that is the slave-master law out in New Testament times, the principle of it. And you say, can you really make that connection? Well, I mean, both of them have the word slave-master in them, so it's pretty good, it's pretty clear. Does this make sense to everybody? Now, you're saying, well, what? Okay, we got that first part, slave-master, but what about the next part about, hey, the slave is a person and we must treat them the same way? Two things. One is in Colossians, and then we need to go to the companion book, which is what book? Philemon. Very good. You guys know, earlier on in Colossians 3, where it talks about put on Christ. Who is Christ? What has he transformed us to be? He has transformed us to be where there is no, verse 11 of chapter 3, someone read it please.
slave and free man, but Christ is all,
Everyone hear that language? Have you ever wondered why Paul makes such an elaboration on, because this is also found in Galatians, yes? And the wordings is a little bit different. Why does he make such a big deal about barbarian, Scythian, slave, free? Because what's the companion book? What's the companion book? Philemon. And who's a main character, maybe not the main character, but a main character in Philemon? Don't say Philemon, I'm talking about the other guy. Onesimus. And Onesimus is a what? Is a slave. And what is Paul already reminding? If you want to exalt Christ, which is what this book is talking about, which is what the church must do, all things unto Christ, even as this very text says, then you have to understand this. The slave is no longer a slave. He's your what? He's your brother. Does this start to make sense to everybody? And that is the message of Philemon, is the power of the work of Christ to make sure that we don't just not, pardon the double negative, we don't just not dehumanize, triple negative. We actually ensure people are what? Christ bearers. And we treat them that way. Speak to me.
So in terms of logistics, not being a slave to Christ, but in terms of being a slave to an earthly master, I have friends who are pointing to that in doubt of the Bible, and they're thinking of a slave the way U.S. citizens think of slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So what actually is a slave in that culture?
Good question. A slave in the culture of Israel, even in the Greco-Roman period, is fundamentally economic. It's fundamentally economic in nature, that someone owes somebody else. That is why the slave laws in Exodus, as well as the slave implications, say in Deuteronomy, they revolve around paying back a debt. It is economic in nature. Whereas in the United States, slaves didn't really owe. They were enslaved. This is a matter of conquest. This was not economic in nature. It was quite different in nature. And wrong in nature. And that's what the Bible's trying to remind us people of, is that even though they owe you, yes, they owe you. We get that. But they're still a human being. And they need to be treated a certain way. And that's why these laws are set in parallel. Yeah? And Egypt's slavery is actually unique because it wasn't exactly economic, it was military and conquest oriented. Yeah? It was, we got to prevent these, it was suppression. It was, we got to prevent these people from taking us over because we just conquered the Hyksos and all that kind of jazz. And so God is saying that's not how it worked. But there is a kind of slavery that is valid, but it's on a totally different level. And that's what we need to portray. Yeah, very good question. Does this make sense to everybody about how to think through laws? And look, this was just one. And there are many, many more in the Old Testament. And we need to learn to think through them because they are instructive. They can be very devotional. They can change your life in how you think about things. And Lord willing, when we get to Deuteronomy, whenever that happens, we'll walk through some and I'll show you more about how this works. And it's just a powerful, powerful, formative thing to see who God is, what He demands, and how our lives rightly can adjust and apply that. All right? Good. So, we're still in review. So having said all this, but this was like a very important side to that review. So having established Israel, giving them this Mosaic covenant that teaches that on one hand, yes, we're no longer under it, but yes, we can learn from it because that was always it was designed to do. Now, God says all of this points back to creation, and in fact, to reiterate that it points back to creation, when Israel is founded, they build the tabernacle, which reminds you of what place? Eden. And Israel is proclaiming to the world, we are acting a certain way to show you this is about creation. This is about going back to the rest that God has established. And we even have a building that tells you, yes, on one hand, we are separated from God, but God has established a way for us to get back to Eden. God has established a way for us to get back to Eden. And so there is this ceremony in Exodus 24. I didn't elaborate on it too much, but just you should just know a couple things about it. Exodus 24 reminds us that God took these bowls of blood, sprinkled the people with the blood so that they were in covenant with him. On one hand, that is communion. On the other hand, that can serve as their accountability. But along the lines of communion with him, the leaders of Israel in Exodus 24, they go up to the mountain and sit at God's feet. So the whole goal of all that is happening here is when God has a covenant relationship, it's the real deal. Okay? Some people argue, in a sense, and that's an important phrase, in a sense, Exodus 24 is the first communion ever in the Bible. Because you have blood and you have people actually communing with God. Or you could put it this way, Exodus 24 is prototypical communion. And actually, that there is some merit in saying that. You can listen to my Hebrews lectures about that, but specifically on Hebrews chapter 8 and 9. But in any case, Exodus 24 shows you what could be. On one hand, there's deep communion because of the blood that is spilled on our behalf. On the other hand, that brings up accountability, which leads us to Exodus 32 and the golden what? Golden calf. We know that. Yeah,
Exodus 24, what kind of relationship?
Covenant relationship. Yep. Exodus 32. Okay, Exodus 32. We should know what happened there. You should know that they disobeyed. And on one hand, God doesn't change his mind. He's not saying, hey, I'm going to destroy Israel, now I'm not. I changed my mind. Nothing like that is going on. Rather, God is setting up the office of mediator. Everyone remember this? And the first mediator is who? Moses. And here's something that we need to point out. Do you guys remember Moses says to God, you can blot me out of the book of life? Remember that? Moses wants to trade his life for others, which is noble. But does God accept that? No. Which shows you, is he the real mediator? And the answer is no. Which sets up for who? Jesus. Okay? Jesus. And by the way, the Old Testament already establishes that. Ezekiel 20 through 23 actually gives you that paradigm. We'll get there when we get there later on in Old Testament survey too. But it just, in Ezekiel, God says, I look for a mediator and there's nobody. Like we ran out of guys. So I became the mediator. Well, that already tells you who Jesus is. Yes, he has to be God because you ran out of human mediators who couldn't do the job anyway. On one hand, this establishes mediator. On the other hand, which doesn't work, which leads to Christ. But on the other hand, there are serious consequences. After all, how many tablets is Moses holding? You guys should remember this. 2. Why? Because they are copies of the what? Law. You get a copy, I get a copy, but he what? He smashes them, which means the deal is what? It's broken. Deal's off. It's over. It's done. So all that can happen now is death, and the Levites kill in one day 3,000 people, with the implication that it's just going to keep going until all of Israel's what? Dead. That's what's going to happen. And so now, if you understand this, the nation is facing national death. Everyone knows it's just a matter of time, and the wrath of God will kill us all. That's what you have to understand. You have to be living in that kind of situation, living in that drama and tension to understand what is going on. Moses has just said, in light of this national death, blot me out. Let me die. Kill me and save all the people. And God says that's not going to work. So you're out of options. Yeah? Your mediator doesn't even work to stop this. The only one you can done now is who? Not you. You only cause more problems. Not even Moses, but who? God. And that's exactly what happens in chapter 33 of Exodus. Here we are. I think we're on the next page, letter E, something like that. Yeah? Exodus 33. This is what God says. In verse 3, he says, I will not go up in your midst. All right? I will not go up in your midst. But because you are a very, very stiff-necked people, lest I consume you along the way. God says, look, I can't be with you guys anymore, but you guys can still go up by yourselves to the land. So is this mercy? Yes, because what could have God done? Kill them all. Mercy, and you need to know this, mercy is not giving you what you deserve. Mercy is not giving you what you deserve. They deserve to die. Mercy is you don't get that. So God says, you guys can go up. I won't go with you, but you can go up. God already gives them mercy. But there's something more that happens. And in letter F, there's this tabernacle of meeting. It's not the tabernacle itself because it doesn't exist yet. But what does he ask? Look at 33 verse 14. Someone read it.
And he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest.
Okay, stop right there. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. That's what Moses wants. He's pleading with God. Come with us. Don't abandon us. I mean, that's what makes Israel Israel. It's that what? It's that God what? What does Israel mean? Fights for you. God fights for you. You've got to stay with us. Otherwise, what's the purpose of us even existing? Stay with us. And this is what God said. I'll go with you. I'll go with you. Now, you have to understand. About 10 minutes ago, Israel's facing what? National death. And then God says, I won't kill you. And then God says, I'm just going to turn everything around and I'll go with you. Okay, if you're like, that's kind of crazy. Let's say you were held hostage by a terrorist who's pointing a gun at your head. And you're like, don't kill me, don't kill me. He's like, I'm going to kill you. You have to die. You're everything I hate. You're everything I despise. I'm going to pull the trigger right now. And then he says, but on second thought, maybe I won't kill you. On third thought, I'll let you go and give you $1 million. You're going to be like, he's like, just shake my hand. You're like, are you I mean, you would have some doubts. Are y'all with me on this? And Moses does too. Because this is too good to be what? True. And we've all learned, or we should have learned by now, if it's too good to be true, it's what? It's not. It's not true. So Moses says, look, God, I need some assurance. I need some assurance. Because this is crazy. And we don't always see it that way because we're not in it as we should be, as the narrative demands us, and we don't have enough time to really develop it as much as I ought to. But just understand that. So verse 18, what does Moses say to God? What does he say?
Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory.
Stop right there. If you show me your glory, then I know you're not lying. Now that's a pretty massive statement, because even as God says, to show the extremity of this statement, no one God shows his glory to can see it and what? And live. So God says, you can't even handle my glory, but I'll do what you ask. Think about that. God doesn't have to listen to Moses at all, but he does, just to prove a point. And at this moment, you begin to understand the glory of God. That's the power of Exodus 34. Do you guys remember me saying from the very beginning of this book is a book of names? Remember that? God reveals his name, Yahweh, at the beginning of the book. I am who I am. You remember that? He begins by explaining the nature of Yahweh, and in the end, he will reveal it fully. And really here, you are at the climax of the book in Exodus 34. Everything's on the line. Are we really going to die? How do we know that God is going to do what he does? By the way, think bigger picture for a second. If Israel dies, if God just slaughters them all, it's not just that their lives end. What also stops? The entire what? The entire world. Because we're all depending on Israel to get the what? The promise of the seed. So we have to ask the question not just, hey, what's going to allow Israel to survive? What's going to allow all of God's plan to survive, yes? And that all revolves around the revelation and the nature of the glory of God. Are y'all with me on this? So let's find out what that is. All right, let's find out what that is. So you guys know that Exodus 34, God begins to reveal his name. And here we are. Someone read verses 6 through 8. And let's do this carefully, and then we'll keep going. Stop. What's weird about this phrase? The Lord, the Lord. Yeah, why do you need to say it what? Twice. Except you should remember that God does sometimes say people's names what? Twice. When he wants to accentuate something very important, when he's summoning them to a task, or revealing something to them that is of the utmost significance. So he repeats his name twice to help you understand who he really what? Is. You want to know what Yahweh means? I am who I am. You want to know what is Yahweh-ness to me? Here it is. Keep going.
God merciful and gracious.
Stop. Okay, the first two words, merciful and gracious. Merciful refers to the fact that God has compassion, like a mother to her child. That God understands what people go through. And he has great compassion and love abounding in that manifestation of his attributes. All right? And in that way. Kindness refers to not just kind of restraining and caring for somebody defensively, but proactively doing good for somebody. Proactively doing good for somebody. In other words, God is not sadistic. Sometimes I think Israel, or maybe even us, we think, well, God's just out to get people. No, he's not. No, he's not. He's not that way. Not that way at all. Keep going.
Slow to anger.
Stop. Slow to anger actually means long of nose in Hebrew, because your nose gets kind of red when you get mad or whatever. So if you have a long nose, it takes a long time. And so that's why he's slow to anger. Very patient. Why is that important for Israel to understand? They should what? Die. But the only reason that they don't instantaneously die is that God is what? Patient. Very patient. You know? That's what the unbeliever needs to understand. No, why doesn't God just kill me right now? Because he's nice. Because he's slow to anger. Slow to anger. Doesn't mean he's passive. It actually means he's actively being patient with you. Keep going. Okay. The ideas of steadfast love, this is the word actually for grace. This is the word for grace. And grace is not God riches at Christ's expense or some weird funny acronym like that or whatever. Grace is God's proactive intervention for your good. Grace is what we call unilateral action. You guys know what unilateral action is? You act by yourself. You act by yourself. Grace is God's unilateral action for your benefit, where he does everything and his power in and of himself, by himself, for your benefit. Grace is not a small thing, it is the big things. It is an enormous exertion of power, power that you don't even have. Just write down this in your notes. Psalm 107, we'll talk about this maybe next semester when we talk about Old Testament Survey 2, but you need to understand that's kind of a psalm dedicated to helping you understand chesed, loving kindness, or grace. Does that make sense? It's a psalm, and this is what it says. It says, I was dying in the wilderness there was no water, there was no town, and then there was a city with a well. It's like, it just came out of nowhere? Yes, because that's what grace does. Where there is not, God creates it. Does that make? I was in the darkest prison of emotional turmoil, and your word came in and it freed me. Liberation, that kind of stuff. You all with me on this? Or it's like, grace is when you're in the storm and it's going crazy, and then God stills the storm. That's what Psalm 107 says. That's the nature of grace. It's not just God being nice. You all with me on this? It's much more than that. It's God turning the whole world upside down so that his promises to you will come true. That's the nature of grace. And look at this for a second. It doesn't just say that God has grace, that God what? Well, what does it say? What's the exact wording? Abounding. He has a lot of it. He doesn't run out. You know, it's not like, what is that game? Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? You get three lifelines or whatever. You don't have that. It's nice. And it's truth. See that word, emet? It's not just faithfulness, it's actually the word truth. God is truth. This is real. It doesn't change. What you see is what you get. And you need to know that about God. Especially Israel needed to know that about God, because what were they facing? National death. And then God says, actually, it's going to be okay. It's going to be better than okay. It's going to be great. You sure? I'm the what? I'm the truth. Of course it's going to be exactly that way. Yeah? Israel is hearing the attributes of God that are so distinctively God and what they so distinctively need to hear at this moment. Yeah? I mean, if you're an Israelite and you just realize you just basically committed a felony against everything that God has stood for as expressed in the Ten Commandments, which you just signed off on, you need to know that you have a God like that. That means a lot. And by the way, when we sin, you need to know we have a God like that. Keep going, verse 7.
Keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin.
Everyone hear that? Iniquity, trespass, and sin. Do you hear that language? Isn't it interesting that there's 3 words for sin there? Now, first, you need to know that each of them have a different meaning, but we don't have time to get into it. But here's the second thing, and here's a big takeaway. Why does God mention 3 different types of sin? It shows you He forgives what? All kinds. Sometimes you think, oh, well, this sin is too big, or this sin's too great, or this sin's too serious. No, it's not. He bears it all. He bears it all. And we need to know that. We need to know that. Israel needed to know that, since they did commit all kinds of sin, like 10 varieties and more. They needed to know, yeah, our God will forgive that. Our God will forgive that. Keep going.
But who will by no means clear the guilty.
Okay, God does not, and this is very important, God does not forgive unjustly. Now that's a double-edged sword. Somebody's got to get punished. Yeah? And He will deal with sin. One way or another, He will deal with it. He will deal with it. You don't just get off scot-free. It could be that He will deal with it with you. As the next phrase says, He will visit the iniquity of the fathers on the sons, and on the sons of the sons unto the 3rd or 4th what? Generations. It could be He deals with you. It could be that He deals with somebody else, but He will be just. Does this make sense to everybody? You need to understand this is your God. And so, let's put it this way. If you have an unjust or unjust, I guess that's a better way to put it, forgiveness, it's a faulty forgiveness. Yeah? Because there's nothing backing it. So He can go back on it at any time. Right? Because if it was just arbitrary, He can take it back. That's why 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, what's the next phrase? He is what? Faithful and what? Just to what? Forgive. Hear the word just there? Why is that important? Because it shows God has to do this because it's the right thing to what? To do. He has no choice. And that's a good thing. God shows, I'm a God of just forgiveness. Of just forgiveness. And there will be justice that is done. I will do justice. Now, could that be done by a sacrifice, ultimate sacrifice of Christ? You better believe it, but justice will be done. Does this make sense to everybody? And God paints for us His nature. Now, when He reveals that nature, now you have the full picture of God. And you just need to jot some notes about this. And let me just say this. This is what distinguishes God above all other supposed deities. This is what distinguishes God above all other supposed deities. In the ancient Near East, gods were capricious. There's no such thing as loving kindness. Okay? God doesn't do anything for anybody unless it benefits himself and only himself. Yes? And people are incidental. This whole notion of grace, no way. This whole notion of love and compassion and kindness, no way. Whole notion of patience, no way. Forgiveness, out of the question. Sin, not even a category. So, this is very unique, God. In fact, have you heard of the book of Micah? Like one of the Old Testament minor prophets. Micah means, who is like you? Okay, that's what it means. And this is the phrase that Micah ends with in Micah 7. Who is a God like you? Hey, his name means what? Who is like you? And he ends with what? Who is like you? See the wordplay there? You guys following what I'm saying? So he ends with his name. He's like, Micah, Micah. But it's a more serious thing. He says, who forgives sin? Micah realizes the lesson originally learned in Exodus 34, that the entire plan of God revolves around the fact that he's this kind of God. That he's this kind of God. And Israel is to point to this kind of God, because the only way you can have redemption and the Exodus and a supreme God who can turn evil to good and all this blessing and show his glory in such a way and have a glory worth proclaiming is if he's a God who is that kind of God. Forgiving, gracious, just, noble, determined, unbending. He's the truth. Does this make sense to everybody? That's the only way it's going to work. And by the way, that's what Israel sings about all the time. Do you guys remember it says sometimes, often in the psalm, it says, give thanks to the Lord for he is good, his loving kindness endures what? Forever. You know what they're singing? They're singing about Exodus 34. Every time the word loving, or not every time, but all the times that a lot of those phraseologies are used, they often point to Exodus 34. Israel's just singing and saying, this is our God. And this is why redemption is going to work. And this is why everyone should follow him. And this is why he's the only God. Does this make sense to everybody? By the way, when we talk about in the New Testament and we sing in our songs, grace, we're actually just building on this passage. Does this make sense to everybody? If you don't understand this passage, you don't understand the concept of grace that runs throughout the whole rest of the New Testament. Y'all with me on this? This becomes definitional for grace. Everyone got that? Exodus 34 becomes definitional for the nature of grace. Israel can't do anything to save themselves. They're facing national death. They can't depend on anyone. There's no individual human being, pure human like Moses, that can do it. They only can depend on God, who intervenes on their behalf. That's the only way they live. And so Israel can really sing this song because they know, were it not for grace, I would not be what? I would not be here. Why? Because my whole nation's life would have ended where? In the book of Exodus. That's the conviction about grace. It's not just God is nice, or that God is accepting, or that he's kind. It's that he intervenes so mightily and so dramatically that makes a universe and a life and death difference. Does that make sense to everybody? That's the power of grace. That's what's established in Exodus 34. Yeah. 34. Does this make sense to everybody? You need to know it. By the way, this becomes definitional of not just grace, but because grace is so tied to God himself, this becomes definitional of God. Which is why in John 1, Jesus is called full of grace and what? Truth. You can't claim that about yourself. It is only God who has that. Y'all with me on this? All right. Exodus 34, massive chapter, loaded with such rich theology. And at this moment, point 7, we there? God's covenant is renewed. Israel starts over. Make 2 new tablets. Why is that important? Yeah, relationships restored. Back to the way it always was, as if nothing had ever happened. That's the power of God's grace. It's like a time machine that reverses everything, which is pretty appropriate for creation. All right, point 8, next page. The Sabbath is reinstituted. You say, why is the Sabbath reinstituted? What did the Sabbath regulation of the Ten Commandments point back to? Creation, like the Sabbath and God's whole agenda. What is God saying? I'm going to start using you guys, or resume using you guys, to do what I always intended to do, to go back to my plan about getting us back to creation and my glory. Hence, letter B, they build the tabernacle, because the tabernacle points back to what? Eden. By the way, Israel is so moved by this, they do all kinds of, they give up all their stuff. In fact, the women, they give up all their mirrors. That's what the text says in 38:8. To give up the bronze of it to help construct the tabernacle. It just shows massive repentance. And now, point 10. The presence of God amongst his people. The glory of God enters the tabernacle. And on one hand, that's great, because has God abandoned his people? No. Could he have abandoned his people? Yes. Did he have a right to do that? Yes. Did he have cause to do that? Yes. He had all those things, but he doesn't. He's there, and it shows that his plan is going to continue. But here's the thing. If you look at chapter 40, it says this, that no one could stand to minister, not even Moses. So on one hand, you have God's glory, his agenda, his purposes are advancing. On the other hand, you have sinful Israel, yes? That cannot connect with that. So the question is, how do you bridge an unholy people with a holy God? Y'all with me on this? How do you bridge an unholy people with a holy God? And that moves you to what book? Just guess. The book of Leviticus. And that's where we're going. Turn the page. What time do we get out? 35? Yeah, okay, good. Perfect. Well, not really, but good. Leviticus. Here's the theological theme. God demands holiness. God demands holiness. And this, sometimes I say, hey, we got some flexibility on how you express themes of books, and we want them distinct and all this kind of jazz. Look, Leviticus is a non-negotiable. It is this theme. Don't just be like, God is cool, or God is sovereign. I mean, that's true, but this is about holiness. Clear, plain, and simple. All right? And let me just walk you through the book. In relationship to the contents of the book, here's what I'm going to just survey through the whole structure of the book in light of this theme really quick. You need to understand that this book demonstrates the holiness of God as lived out and reflected in Israel's life. That's the whole point of this book. The book is to show how the holiness of God, what that means, what that looks like as reflected and lived out through Israel's life. And the way that works is that God will show in a variety of ways how holy he is. For example, God is holy in the way you become holy. You don't get to negotiate that. That is consecrated. That is set and established and thereby set apart, dedicated for a certain purpose. God is holy in your preferences. That's another thing. Think, wow. He's holy in opinions. Think about that. There are some things that are objectively right and wrong, yes? And then there's the gray area. Y'all with me on this? He's holy even in the gray areas. That's what you have to understand. He is holy. You understand the way his holiness operates relative to salvation. You understand the way his holiness operates relative to your time and to the community, a group of people together, or to you as an individual. You understand holiness on every single level. That is the design of this book. Does this make sense to everybody? Okay? And we'll walk through this in more detail, but if you have that feel already, you're going to understand the nature of this book. In relationship to the original audience, like I just said, how can a sinful people live with a holy God? How can a sinful people live with a holy God? This is what this book answers. This book provides that theology. Put it this way, how can a God say, I forgive, yet I take vengeance on all those who commit sin? How do you reconcile those two? Yes? Leviticus is the answer to that. Everyone got that? Leviticus is the answer to that. It points you to that way. And in generations beyond this, that would be to us. Understand this. You want to understand God's holiness? Read this book. we just say, oh, God's holy, he's nice, he's perfect. No, really wrestle with it. Wrestle it with this book. Second, if you really want to understand worship and salvation, read this book. If you really want to understand worship and salvation, read this book. If you want to understand the way that holiness should be lived in our lives, read this book. Again, do you have to do exactly what this book says? The answer is what? No, this book never intended for that to happen. It intended that at one point in time regulations will change, and within that, even when there's a change of regulations, you're still going to live out the truth of what? Holiness. But it's instructive. Does this make sense? It's illustrative. It's instructive of what holiness looks like in life. Okay? So you could put it this way. You learn that what it means that God is holy. You learn about salvation and worship, and you learn about sanctification. Got that? God's holiness, salvation and worship, sanctification. And you really learn what holiness means. By the way, Leviticus is quoted throughout the New Testament. We already mentioned one, Leviticus 18:5. But here's another, and actually Leviticus 18 is quoted a bunch of times indirectly and alluded to a bunch of times indirectly about some sexual ethic issues. But on top of that, you guys should remember Leviticus 19:1. Be holy for what? For I am holy. That's the key of this whole book. And that's what 1 Peter reminds us about, is we're to be like God in his holiness. And so there are lessons to be learned from this book that change our lives. Questions so far? All right. Oh, yeah. Good.
Wait, so God never intended Israel to follow his law word for word?
Oh, no, they did. Yeah, they did. So that the intent is like this. I intend for Israel to do these laws, to have an international impact, and to also learn from them, so that when there is a time when the new covenant will come, they will have learned the lessons of this law, and they will live them to the fullest because they'll have the capacity to do so. Okay? Now, we're in the tail end of that part, so we still have to live out the certain intent, certain aspects of that intent. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's where you just have to learn things. If you want a quick illustration of this, a parent might tell their kid, hey, we always need to uphold justice, something like that. So a kid says, okay, uphold justice. So, your brother's crying, and you said, hey, older brother, what'd you do? And he's like, I just spanked my younger brother. Like crazy. And you're like, what? Why'd you do that? I'm upholding justice. He took the toy, and I am exacting vengeance. You're like, and you told me to do that. You're like, well, wait a minute. There's a range, yes, of intent there about how justice is going to look like and who does what and exactly how, right? And what you just did was actually unjust. So now I have to exact vengeance against you, we got to understand that that's the same way the law works. The law for some is going to work this way, like for Israel. It's going to work this way because they're part of that whole intent package. But for us, the way it intends for us to do it is going to be slightly different. But that's all part of its intent. Just like a parent's intent works that way. Yeah?
And there's a lot of unbelievers who have problems with the Old Testament law. Who
Yeah.
say, there's a lot of really harsh laws. What would be the best way to explain this concept to them?
Yeah, two things. First, you need to remind them that the law was to operate at a certain given time to teach God's holiness. So, just like a coupon or whatever operates for a certain time, this law is no longer in force. But that doesn't let you off the hook. Because what they're really rebelling against about the harshness of the law is holiness. Right? They're not just thinking, oh, what an austere command. Look, we could point to lots of austere commands in America. Like, you can only drive the speed limit on the freeway. Like, well, they're cramping my style or whatever. I mean, I want to go fast to this place. I don't want to be late, Our taxes or whatever. We could complain about a lot. That's not the issue. The hard issue is this. They really don't want holiness. Yeah. That's their main concern. That's the difference between a weird law that you help them understand and a law they think is harsh. See the difference between the two? Yeah. A weird law, yeah. We got weird laws too, but actually this law makes sense because it teaches something that you probably won't like. Yeah. Uh-huh.
A question in terms of the inability of the law to save.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a truth that was acknowledged by the people as they were given it, or is it something that we can at this point look back and understand?
Oh no, it'll be pretty clear. Yeah, Moses is going to make a big deal.
Is it fair to say that the law also functions in terms of like being self-referential in its own inability to?
Oh yeah. That's part of why it's intended the way it is. Yeah, Moses is going to do something hilarious in Deuteronomy as he's summing everything up. And I'll just say it now because I think it's so funny. And why not? But he keeps saying the law points, because that's what it does, right? It points. It points that you need to have a heart that loves God. Love the Lord your God with all your what? Heart. And you need to have a right heart to do that. You need to have a circumcised heart. And then Moses concludes in Deuteronomy 29, and the law also teaches you can't. So, we're supposed to love God with all our heart. True. We need a circumcised heart to do that. True. And we can't do that. True. So, the law is like going to save us? False. Can't. Because you can't. Sorry. And everyone's like, excuse me, like, how is God going to fulfill all his promises if this doesn't happen? And Moses says the famous verse, Deuteronomy 29:29. Anyone know the verse? The secret things belong to the Lord. This is a famous verse we use about a lot of mysteries, Calvinism, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And ironically, Moses is like, I'm first Calvinist. You can't. How does that work? Secret things belong to the Lord. And but thankfully, he actually explains it more in the next chapter, and that's where you anticipate things to come. But yes, the law self-referentially just says, I'm a teacher. That's all I do. And guess what? I'm teaching you that you're doomed because you can't do it. And so that's where Deuteronomy 29 becomes very, very important, and 30, in understanding the nature of the law. Yeah, great question. All right, speaking of which, we need to keep going in Leviticus. So next page, historical background information. All right. Bunch of things here. Let's see if we can do this. You need to remember that the laws of the Old Testament have an ancient Near Eastern background to them. That's where the weird stuff comes in. Because people say, I don't understand this law. Well, you need to understand the history behind it. Of course it doesn't make sense. Laws, like we said, are language. We said that before. Laws are language. So you've got to understand the cultural communication these laws would do. Whether that be tattoos or food or whatever. Have ancient Near Eastern background. That means they have a background of the culture of that time. They have the background of the culture of that time. So, you have to understand that these laws, when people of that time would see them, they would understand what is going on, even though we don't always. Whether that be, like I said, tattoos, or food laws, or laws concerning the shedding of blood, or the spilling of blood, all these kinds of things that we're kind of thinking, that's bizarre, I don't understand that. Well, that's because you're not living in that time. So we need to kind of get our minds in that time so we understand that actions do speak louder than words. Are you all with me on this? All right. Now, within this, you need to understand that the law, again, it is administrative in nature. It is a model of what is happening. Okay? It is a model of what is happening. All right? And so, a lot of things in the Old Testament where they're doing certain things, they are acting out theological truths, right? So we have first ancient Near Eastern backgrounds. Through that you communicate things about God. You have second that that the law is designed to be a model. It's meant in and of itself not to save, but to be a model for that which does save. See the difference between the two? A model car cannot take you to Walmart. But it tells you that these things do exist that look like this that can take you to Walmart. Y'all with me on this? Okay? And the law is a model. Here's the third thing. As such, because it is a model, if you put your trust in what the law pointed to, you can be saved. Does that make sense? If you put your trust in what the law pointed to, you can be saved. But you say, wait a minute, hold the phone. Okay, I see, like if you're doing the sacrificial system, you start to understand the theology of the law, not that the sacrifices in and of themselves, they only save within the model. You all with me on this? They only save within the model of what is going on. But there's something bigger than that, and I need to put my trust in Christ about how holiness and atonement and all that stuff is going to work. But Jesus hasn't died yet on the cross. Y'all with me on this? So how does that work? Have you ever heard of a credit card? All right, let's think about credit cards. How many of you, it's okay, Dave Ramsey's is not here. How many of you own a credit card? Okay, that's fine. No shame. Dave Ramsey is not present. All right? Now, when you go to a store and use your credit card and buy something, are you arrested by the police? No. You're like, Dave Ramsey's not there either, okay? No one's coming after me. All right. Did you pay for it? Did you pay for that item that you just used your credit card for? Technically, what? No. When do you actually pay for it? Some of you are like, never! No, you will, okay? That's not how it works. All right, we call that theft. That's breaking one of the 10. All right, which actually goes back to creation, which you should apply now to credit cards, even though the Bible never had the idea, well, credit cards as a piece of plastic, etc. Now, you pay for that when you get your bill, yeah? So why doesn't somebody slam you with stealing that object because you didn't pay for it? Because they what? They gave you a credit. Yes? They said, based on a future payment, I will allow you to do something so meaningless, like swipe a piece of plastic, hold up your phone and wave it around. You think the Old Testament's where wave offering or whatever? What do you do with your phone? Woo, woo, woo. I mean, come on. You guys are just as bizarre, all right? And by doing this magical thing, you are looking forward to a future payment. Does this make sense? Now, this is a model, yeah? It's a model. It doesn't save you in and of itself. When it talks about atoning for sin, it's within the model. You all with me on this? It's not saying, hey, now you're officially saved. It's saying, relative to your relationship with God in this agreement, in this covenant, you are okie dokie. Y'all with me on this? But that doesn't mean that you are what? Saved from your sins eternally forever. Y'all with me on this? But the whole model is purpose that, just like a model does, it is to reflect something that happens on a bigger level, yes? And when you put your trust, God will do this on the bigger level. Even though Christ has not come, your sins are forgiven. Why? Because God knew there was going to be a future what? Payment. So he can credit it to you as what? Righteousness. Does this make sense to everybody? This is very critical for your understanding of Leviticus. Speak to me.
Does that mean that, when you explain like that, this is the picture that what I get, like all the Israelites who came into the land, I think maybe that means maybe they got saved, because like according to scriptures, almost everybody was going for sacrifices, everyone was just so obedient to that. So can we just make a conclusion that all of them, they got saved through this promise which was the...
Yeah, did everyone who participated in the sacrificial system, were they saved? The answer is no. Why? Because those sacrifices in and of themselves, they were just what? A model. Yeah, they were just a picture. So that doesn't save you. That just what? Teaches you, yes? But if you believe in what does save you, then God, based on the future work of Christ, redeems us and justifies those in the Old Testament. Does that make sense? That's what's going on there. And that's why God can take to task people who are sacrificing in the Old Testament and doing it right, because their heart's still bad. So yes, relative to the system, they're okay, but not everything is relative to the system. There's something bigger than that system that they need to be concerned about, something eternal, something that the system was always pointing to, what it was teaching. And as a result of not adhering to what the law fully taught, they were condemned. Does that make sense? If you understand that, then we're good to go on the nature of Leviticus. Have a good day.